Do you want to successfully complete the D265 Objective Assessment exam? Then you are in the right place. Our website provides a list of questions and answers for your success in the D265 OA exam for free. We understand that acing your OA exam can be quite challenging. That's why we provide completely free exam guides and practice questions for you. In this video, we will cover questions from critical thinking, reasoning elements, question types, causal methods, evidence quality. So let's get started. 1. A project manager must evaluate whether a proposed selection model accurately mirrors how the company conducts its operations and aligns with existing resources and capabilities. Which model selection criterion is the project manager primarily assessing in this evaluation scenario? A. Capable. B. Comparable. C. Realistic. D. Flexible. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Realistic. Explanation: option C is correct because the realistic criterion ensures the model accurately reflects how the organisation does business and is appropriate for its resources, capabilities, and external environment. Option A is incorrect because the capable criterion focuses on whether the model uses factors relevant to the organisation rather than reflecting how operations are conducted overall. Option B is incorrect because the comparable criterion addresses whether the model can be used across multiple projects for comparison purposes rather than reflecting operational alignment. Option D is incorrect because the flexible criterion deals with the model providing accurate measures across changing conditions rather than mirroring existing business operations and resources. Let's dig into what it really means to improve your thinking. In this scenario, a manager spots flaws in her marketing strategy, examines where her logic went wrong, and builds a revised approach. That's the improvement dimension of critical thinking in action. Paul and Elder identify this as one of the core dimensions, taking your own thinking apart, finding the weak spots and making it better. The other options here miss the mark. Dismissing alternative viewpoints? That's actually an obstacle to good thinking, not a feature of it. Making generalizations without evidence is a bad habit Paul and Elder call out specifically. And forming false beliefs is a barrier, not a building block. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When you see a scenario where someone identifies flaws in their own reasoning and then fixes them, that's the improvement dimension. Quick recall hook: improve =, inspect and rebuild. 2. During a team meeting, an employee notices her emotional reaction to criticism and pauses to examine why she feels defensive before responding thoughtfully. This behaviour most closely aligns with which characteristic of critical thinking that Paul and Elder describe? A. Self-monitored thinking. B. Spontaneous and non-reflective. C. Egocentric reasoning. D. First-order thinking. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Self-monitored thinking. Explanation: option A is correct because the employee demonstrated awareness of her own mental processes and emotional responses, which represents the self-monitoring aspect of critical thinking. Option B is incorrect because spontaneous and non-reflective thinking characterizes first-order or ordinary thinking, which does not involve conscious analysis of thought processes. Option C is incorrect because egocentric reasoning involves viewing everything in relationship to oneself, which is a barrier to critical thinking rather than a characteristic. Option D is incorrect because first-order thinking is ordinary thinking that lacks the conscious realization and analysis that the employee demonstrated in this scenario. This question gets at self-monitored thinking, a key characteristic Paul and Elder describe. Here's the scene. An employee notices her emotional reaction to criticism, pauses, examines why she feels defensive, and then responds thoughtfully. That pause and examination is self-monitoring. She's aware of her own mental processes and emotional responses as they happen. Now look at the wrong answers. Spontaneous and non-reflective describes first order or ordinary thinking. No conscious analysis happening there. Egocentric reasoning means viewing everything through a self-centered lens, which is a barrier to critical thinking, not a feature. First-order thinking is just regular thinking, without that conscious awareness the employee showed. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone pauses to examine their own emotional reactions or thought processes before responding, that's self-monitored thinking. Quick recall hook. Self-monitor =, stop and scan your mind. 3. A researcher automatically dismisses a colleague's findings because they contradict her established theory without examining the evidence presented. According to Paul and Elder, which impediment to sound thinking does this researcher primarily exhibit in her response? A. Making generalizations unsupported by evidence. B. Letting stereotypes shape thinking. C. Thinking deceptively about experiences, DD. Dismissing conflicting viewpoints. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer. D. Dismissing conflicting viewpoints. Explanation. Option D is correct because the researcher rejected the colleague's findings solely because they conflicted with her beliefs, which exemplifies dismissing or attacking opposing views. Option A is incorrect because although problematic, the researcher's issue was not about forming generalizations but rather rejecting evidence that challenged her existing conclusions. Option B is incorrect because the scenario does not involve categorizing people based on group membership, but rather intellectual resistance to challenging information. Option C is incorrect because thinking deceptively about experiences involves distorting personal experiences, not rejecting external research findings that contradict established beliefs. This one targets a common roadblock to sound thinking. A researcher automatically dismisses a colleague's findings because they contradict her established theory. She doesn't even look at the evidence. That's dismissing conflicting viewpoints, one of the impediments Paul and Elder warn about. She's rejecting information purely because it challenges what she already believes. The other options don't fit. Making generalizations without evidence is problematic, but that's not what's happening here. She's not forming new generalizations. She's rejecting external evidence. Letting stereotypes shape thinking involves categorizing people by group membership, which isn't the issue. Thinking deceptively about experiences means distorting your own personal experiences, not rejecting someone else's research. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone rejects evidence or arguments solely because they conflict with existing beliefs, that's dismissing conflicting viewpoints. Quick recall hook. Dismiss =, defense against disagreement. 4. Paul and Elder suggest that becoming an effective self-critic requires making a specific commitment. A new employee wants to develop her critical thinking abilities following their guidance. What commitment should she prioritize according to their framework? A. Avoiding all negative feedback. B. Learning about thinking. C. Memorizing logical rules. D. Following authority figures. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer. B. Learning about thinking. Explanation. Option B is correct because Paul and Elder emphasize that becoming an effective self-critic requires a commitment to learning about thinking, making its study second nature. Option A is incorrect because avoiding negative feedback prevents the self-evaluation necessary for critical thinking development and contradicts the goal of identifying weaknesses in reasoning. Option C is incorrect because while logical rules matter, Paul and Elder specifically emphasize learning about thinking as a broader commitment beyond memorizing formulas. Option D is incorrect because following authority figures without question contradicts the self-directed nature of critical thinking that Paul and Elder describe as essential. Paul and Elder say becoming an effective self-critic requires a specific commitment, and that commitment is learning about thinking. not memorizing rules or following authorities, but actually studying how thinking works and making that study second nature. A new employee wanting to develop critical thinking skills should prioritize this. Why not the other options? Avoiding negative feedback prevents the self-evaluation you need. You can't improve if you shield yourself from criticism. Memorizing logical rules matters, but Paul and Elder emphasize something broader: understanding thinking itself. Following authority figures without question contradicts the entire point of critical thinking, which is self-directed. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When asked about the commitment needed for critical thinking development, remember it's about learning about thinking, making that study a habit. Quick recall hook: self-critic =, student of thinking. 5. A student initially accepts a political argument because it sounds persuasive. Later, she consciously analyzes the argument structure, assesses its validity, and reconstructs her understanding. Her thinking has transitioned between which two levels that Paul and Elder distinguish? A. First order to second order thinking. B. Weak sense to strong sense thinking. C. Inert information to activated knowledge. D. Egocentrism to sociocentrism. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer: A. First order to second order thinking. Explanation: Option A is correct because the student moved from spontaneous acceptance without reflection to consciously analysing, assessing, and reconstructing her understanding of the argument presented. Option B is incorrect because weak sense and strong sense thinking relate to ethical orientation and fair-mindedness, not the transition from unreflective to reflective thinking. Option C is incorrect because this terminology describes information states in the mind, not the levels of thinking that characterize ordinary versus critical approaches. Option D is incorrect because egocentrism and sociocentrism are both barriers to critical thinking, rather than levels of thinking that demonstrate intellectual progression. Here we see the transition from first order to second order thinking. A student initially accepts a political argument just because it sounds persuasive. That's first order thinking, spontaneous and unreflective. Later, she consciously analyzes the argument structure, assesses its validity, and reconstructs her understanding. That shift to deliberate analysis is second order thinking. The other options describe different concepts. Weak sense to strong sense thinking relates to ethical orientation and fair-mindedness, not reflective versus unreflective. Inert information to activated knowledge describes how information sits in your mind, not levels of thinking. Egocentrism and sociocentrism are both barriers to critical thinking, not stages you progress through. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone moves from accepting ideas without reflection to consciously analysing and reconstructing understanding, that's first order to second order thinking. Quick recall hook: first =, fast acceptance, second =, slow analysis. 6. A marketing analyst is developing a campaign strategy and must consider her target audience, gather customer data, make assumptions about buying behaviour, and draw conclusions about effective messaging approaches. How many elements of reasoning are always present when she engages in this thinking process? A. 4 elements. B. 6 elements. C. 7 elements. D. 8 elements. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer: D. 8 elements. Explanation: Option D is correct because Paul and Elder identify exactly 8 universal elements of reasoning that are always present whenever we think, regardless of whether we reason well or poorly. Option A is incorrect because 4 elements represents only half of the complete set of reasoning components that Paul and Elder identify as present in all thinking. Option B is incorrect because 6 elements would omit 2 essential components from the complete framework that constitutes the fundamental structures of thought. Option C is incorrect because 7 elements would still leave out one component from the comprehensive set that Paul and Elder describe as always present. Paul and Elder identify exactly 8 elements of reasoning that are always present whenever we think, regardless of whether we're thinking well or poorly. A marketing analyst considering her audience, gathering data, making assumptions and drawing conclusions is using all 8 elements, even if she's not consciously aware of them. The question asks how many elements are always present, and the answer is 8. 4 would be only half the complete set. 6 would leave out 2 components. 7 would still miss one. The 8 elements work together as a complete framework: purpose, question, information, interpretation, concepts, assumptions, implications, and point of view. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When asked how many elements of reasoning are always present in thinking, the answer is 8. Always 8. Quick recall hook. Elements equal sign 8 every time. 7. A healthcare administrator is preparing a policy recommendation. She identifies her objective for the policy, then frames questions about implementation. According to Paul and Elder's framework, what is the relationship between these 2 elements of reasoning in her process? A. They function completely independently. B. Questions determine the purpose. C. Purpose affects how questions are asked. D. They have no meaningful connection. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Purpose affects how questions are asked. Explanation. Option C is correct because Paul and Elder specifically state that our purpose affects how we ask questions, demonstrating the interdependent relationship among reasoning elements. Option A is incorrect because the elements of reasoning function interdependently, according to Paul and Elder, not as isolated components that operate in separation. Option B is incorrect because the directional relationship Paul and Elder describe moves from purpose to questions, not the reverse direction suggested by this option. Option D is incorrect because Paul and Elder explicitly describe a meaningful chain of influence among the elements, with purpose directly affecting question formulation. This question explores how elements of reasoning connect to each other. A healthcare administrator identifies her objective for a policy, then frames questions about implementation. Paul and Elder specifically state that purpose affects how we ask questions. There's a directional relationship. Your purpose shapes the questions you ask. The elements don't function independently. They're interconnected. It's not that questions determine purpose. That's backwards. And saying they have no meaningful connection ignores what Paul and Elder explicitly describe: a chain of influence among the elements. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Remember the direction. Purpose comes first and shapes questions. Purpose affects questions, not the other way around. Quick recall hook. Purpose points to questions. 8. A project manager gathers market research data and interprets it to mean competitors are struggling. This interpretation then shapes how she categorizes the competitive landscape in her analysis. Which sequence of reasoning elements does this scenario demonstrate, according to Paul and Elder? A. Information affects inferences affects concepts. B. Concepts affects assumptions affects implications. C. Assumptions affects information affects purpose. D. Point of view affects questions affects data. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Information affects inferences affects concepts. Explanation. Option A is correct, because Paul and Elder state that information affects inferences, and what we infer affects how we conceptualize, which matches the scenario's progression. Option B is incorrect because this sequence does not reflect the manager's process of moving from data gathering to interpretation to categorization as described. Option C is incorrect because the scenario begins with gathering information rather than starting with assumptions, contradicting the sequence this option proposes for elements. Option D is incorrect because the scenario describes a progression starting from data collection, not from an initial point of view shaping subsequent questions. This scenario shows how reasoning elements flow into each other. A project manager gathers market research data. That's information. She interprets it to mean competitors are struggling. That's making inferences. This interpretation then shapes how she categorizes the competitive landscape. That's conceptualizing. Paul and Elder describe this exact chain. Information affects inferences, and what we infer affects how we conceptualize. The other sequences don't match. Concepts affecting assumptions, affecting implications is a different chain. Assumptions affecting information, affecting purpose doesn't reflect gathering data first. Point of view affecting questions, affecting data starts from a different place entirely. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When you see data gathering leading to interpretation, leading to categorization, that's the information to inferences to concepts chain. Quick recall hook. Info feeds, inference feeds, concepts. 9. A financial analyst preparing investment recommendations realizes she must examine the theories and principles guiding her analysis and assess whether they are clear, precise, and relevant to client needs. Which element of reasoning is she primarily evaluating in this self-assessment? A. Information. B. Concepts. C. Assumptions. D. Implications. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Concepts. Explanation. Option B is correct because concepts include the theories, principles, axioms, and rules implicit in reasoning, which is exactly what the analyst is examining and evaluating. Option A is incorrect because information refers to data, facts, experiences, and observations used in reasoning, not the theoretical frameworks guiding analytical approaches. Option C is incorrect because assumptions are unstated beliefs taken for granted, distinct from the explicit theories and principles the analyst is consciously examining. Option D is incorrect because implications are consequences that follow from reasoning, not the foundational theories and principles being evaluated in this scenario. A financial analyst is examining the theories and principles guiding her analysis, checking if they're clear, precise, and relevant. What element of reasoning is she evaluating? Concepts. Paul and Elder define concepts as including the theories, principles, axioms, and rules implicit in our reasoning. That's exactly what she's examining. Information is different. That's data, facts, experiences, and observations. Assumptions are unstated beliefs taken for granted, but she's looking at explicit theoretical frameworks. Implications are consequences that follow from reasoning, not the foundational theories themselves. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone examines the theories, principles, or rules guiding their thinking, they're evaluating concepts. Quick recall hook. Concepts equal sign theories and principles. 10. A policy researcher notices that her conclusions seem to favour outcomes benefiting her organisation. Paul and Elder suggest she should pose specific questions to examine this potential bias. Which element of reasoning should she primarily focus on questioning? A. Assumptions she takes for granted. B. Information sources she relied upon. C. Implications of her conclusions. D. Point of view from which she reasons. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D. Point of view from which she reasons. Explanation. Option D is correct because Paul and Elder suggest asking whether one is so rooted in a viewpoint that alternative perspectives cannot be seen, which addresses organisational bias. Option A is incorrect because while assumptions matter, the described bias relates most directly to the vantage point from which she views the issue and draws conclusions. Option B is incorrect because although information sources are relevant, the core issue is the perspective shaping interpretation, rather than the data sources themselves. Option C is incorrect because implications follow from conclusions rather than causing the bias. The researcher needs to examine her viewpoint before reaching conclusions. A policy researcher notices her conclusions seem to favour her organisation's interests. Paul and Elder would say she needs to question her point of view, the vantage point from which she reasons. They suggest asking whether you're so rooted in your viewpoint that you can't see alternatives. That directly addresses organisational bias. While assumptions matter, the described bias relates most to the perspective shaping her interpretation. Information sources are relevant, but the core issue is her vantage point, not the data itself. Implications follow from conclusions rather than causing the bias. She needs to examine her viewpoint before reaching conclusions. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When bias seems tied to whose interests benefit, question the point of view element. Quick E, recall hook. Bias in conclusions? Check your point of view. 11. A student is asked to identify the author of a famous novel for a literature exam. This question has only one correct answer based on established historical records. According to Paul and Elder's framework for categorizing questions, which type of question does this represent? A. Question of fact. B. Question of preference. C. Question of judgment. D. Question of analysis. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, A. Question of fact. Explanation. Option A is correct because questions of fact have definitive answers based on evidence and reasoning within a single system, serving as the basis of knowledge. Option B is incorrect because questions of preference involve subjective choice with no judgment or assessment required, which does not apply to factual authorship. Option C is incorrect because questions of judgment have multiple reasoned answers with some better than others, unlike the single correct answer for authorship. Option D is incorrect because question of analysis is not one of the three categories Paul and Elder identify in their framework for understanding different question types. Who wrote a famous novel? That's a question of fact. Paul and Elder categorize questions into three types, and questions of fact have definitive answers based on evidence and reasoning within a single system. There's one correct answer here. It's documented in historical records. Questions of preference involve subjective choice with no judgment needed. That doesn't apply to authorship since it's not a matter of personal taste. Questions of judgment have multiple reasoned answers where some are better than others, but authorship has a single correct answer. Question of analysis isn't even one of Paul and Elder's three categories. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When a question has one definitive, verifiable answer, it's a question of fact. Quick recall hook. Fact = one fixed answer. 12. A friend asks you what colour you think she should paint her bedroom walls. You could answer blue, green or yellow, and none of these answers would be objectively better than the others. According to Paul and Elder, which type of question is your friend asking you? A. Question of fact. B. Question of judgment. C. Question of analysis. D. Question of preference. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer. D. Question of preference. Explanation. Option D is correct because questions of preference have many possible answers based on subjective choice, with no judgment or assessment, making one answer objectively superior. Option A is incorrect because questions of fact require definitive answers based on evidence, but paint colour selection involves personal taste without objective correctness. Option B is incorrect because questions of judgment have competing answers where some are better than others based on reasoning, unlike purely subjective preferences. Option C is incorrect because question of analysis is not among the three question categories that Paul and Elder describe in their critical thinking framework. What colour should I paint my bedroom? Blue, green, yellow. None is objectively better than the others. That's a question of preference. Paul and Elder describe these as questions with many possible answers based on subjective choice, with no judgment or assessment making one superior. Questions of fact need definitive answers based on evidence, but paint colour is personal taste. Questions of judgment have competing answers where some are better based on reasoning, but colour preference doesn't work that way. Question of analysis isn't one of the three categories Paul and Elder identify. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When no answer is objectively better and it's purely personal choice, that's a question of preference. Quick recall hook. Preference equals sign personal pick, no wrong answer. 13. An education committee debates how to improve elementary school reading outcomes. Different experts propose competing approaches, each supported by research and reasoning, though some proposals appear more comprehensive than others. Which type of question is the committee addressing? A. Question of fact. B. Question of preference. C. Question of judgment. D. Question of definition. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Question of judgment. Explanation. Option C is correct because questions of judgment involve evidence and reasoning within multiple systems, have competing answers, and require reasoned judgment to determine better solutions. Option A is incorrect because questions of fact have single correct answers, whereas improving education outcomes involves multiple legitimate approaches requiring reasoned evaluation. Option B is incorrect because questions of preference involve purely subjective choice without assessment, but educational effectiveness can be evaluated through evidence and reasoning. Option D is incorrect because questions of definition seek to classify something and do not address complex problems with competing solutions. An education committee debates how to improve reading outcomes. Different experts propose competing approaches, each backed by research, though some appear more comprehensive. This is a question of judgment. Paul and Elder describe these as questions involving evidence and reasoning within multiple systems, where there are competing answers and some are better than others. It requires reasoned evaluation. Questions of fact have single correct answers, but educational effectiveness involves multiple legitimate approaches. Questions of preference are purely subjective with no assessment, but educational outcomes can be evaluated through evidence. Question of definition isn't one of the three types. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When there are multiple reasoned answers and some are better than others based on evidence, that's a question of judgment. Quick recall hook. Judgment equals sign judge between reasoned options. 14. Paul and Elder warn that critical thinking is short-circuited under a specific circumstance related to question types. A citizen dismisses a complex policy debate by saying everyone's opinion is equally valid. What mistake is this citizen making according to their framework? A. Accepting subjective responses to judgment questions. B. Treating fact questions as preference questions. C. Confusing preference questions with fact questions. D. Applying evidence to preference questions. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Accepting subjective responses to judgment questions. Explanation. Option A is correct because Paul and Elder maintain that critical thinking is short-circuited when people accept subjective responses to questions of judgment that require reasoned evaluation. Option B is incorrect because the citizen's error involves treating judgment questions as if they were preference questions, not treating fact questions incorrectly. Option C is incorrect because the scenario describes a policy debate requiring judgment, not a preference question being confused with a factual inquiry. Option D is incorrect because applying evidence to questions is appropriate for judgment questions. The error is treating reasoned questions as purely subjective matters. A citizen dismisses a complex policy debate by saying everyone's opinion is equally valid. Paul and Elder warn this short-circuits critical thinking. The mistake? Accepting subjective responses to questions of judgment Policy debates are judgment questions. They require evidence and reasoned evaluation, with some answers genuinely better than others. Treating them as if all opinions are equal turns a judgment question into a preference question. The citizen isn't treating fact questions as preference questions. This is about judgment. They're not confusing preference with fact. And applying evidence to questions is exactly what you should do with judgment questions. That's not the error. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone claims all opinions are equally valid on a matter requiring reasoned evaluation, they're wrongly accepting subjective responses to judgment questions. Quick recall hook. All equal on judgment = wrong category. 15. A researcher develops questions about childhood reading problems, including which diagnostic tools work best and which intervention methods are most effective. These questions require evidence, reasoning, and consideration of multiple approaches. How should she categorize these research questions? A. Questions of fact. B. Questions of judgment. C. Questions of preference. D. Questions of definition. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Questions of judgment. Explanation. Option B is correct because these questions require evidence, reasoning, and consideration of multiple schools of thought, with some answers potentially better than others based on criteria. Option A is incorrect because questions of fact have single definitive answers, whereas determining effectiveness involves competing perspectives and reasoned evaluation of evidence. Option C is incorrect because questions of preference involve subjective choice without assessment. But diagnostic and intervention effectiveness can be evaluated through research evidence. Option D is incorrect because questions of definition is not one of the 3 question types that Paul and Elder describe in their framework for critical thinking. A researcher develops questions about childhood reading problems. Which diagnostic tools work best? Which interventions are most effective? These require evidence, reasoning, and consideration of multiple approaches. How should she categorize them? Questions of judgment. They involve evidence and reasoning across different schools of thought, with some answers potentially better than others based on criteria. Questions of fact have single definitive answers, but diagnostic and intervention effectiveness involves competing perspectives. Questions of preference are subjective with no assessment, but effectiveness can be evaluated through research. Question of definition isn't one of Paul and Elder's 3 types. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Research questions about what works best that require weighing evidence are questions of judgment. Quick recall hook. Best = judgment needed. 16. Health investigators discover that all 20 patients who developed food poisoning ate at the same restaurant on the same evening. The investigators are looking for what all the cases share to identify the source of contamination. Which of Mill's methods are they primarily using in this investigation? A. Single difference method. B. Process of elimination. C. Common factor method. D. Concomitant variation method. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Common factor method. Explanation. Option C is correct because the common factor method involves analysing causation by looking for a single shared factor among all cases, which is the restaurant connection. Option A is incorrect because the single difference method looks for a causal factor present in one situation but absent in another similar situation. Option B is incorrect because the process of elimination involves successively ruling out non-causal factors until one correct factor remains, not identifying shared characteristics. Option D is incorrect because concomitant variation involves looking for patterns of variation between possible causes and effects, not shared factors among cases. 20 patients got food poisoning, and investigators discover they all ate at the same restaurant the same evening. They're looking for what all cases share. This is Mill's common factor method, analysing causation by finding a single shared element among all affected cases. The single difference method looks for what's present in one situation, but absent in a similar one, not what's shared across all. Process of elimination means ruling out possibilities one by one until one remains. Concomitant variation looks for patterns where cause and effect vary together. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When investigators identify what all affected cases have in common, that's the common factor method. Quick recall hook. Common equals sign what they all share. 17. Two groups of tourists visited the same tropical island. Only the tourists who hiked through a specific jungle area developed a rare infection, while those who stayed at the resort remained healthy. Which of Mill's methods would best explain the causation in this scenario? A. Single difference method. B. Common factor method. C. Concomitant variation method. D. Process of elimination method. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, A. Single difference method. Explanation. Option A is correct because the single difference method looks for a causal factor present in one situation but absent in another similar situation, like jungle exposure. Option B is incorrect because the common factor method looks for shared elements among affected cases, not the difference between affected and unaffected groups. Option C is incorrect because concomitant variation involves patterns of change between cause and effect, not comparing presence and absence of a single factor. Option D is incorrect because process of elimination involves ruling out possibilities systematically rather than identifying a distinguishing factor between groups. Two tourist groups visited an island. Only those who hiked through a specific jungle area got infected. Resort stayers remained healthy. What's present in one group but absent in another similar group? That's Mill's single difference method. You're looking for the distinguishing factor between affected and unaffected groups. The common factor method looks for shared elements among affected cases, not differences between groups. Concomitant variation involves patterns of change together, not presence versus absence. Process of elimination means ruling out possibilities sequentially, not comparing two groups. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When one group is affected and another isn't, look for what differs. That's the single difference method. Quick recall hook. Single difference equals sign one group has it, one doesn't. 18. Researchers studying a new medication expose laboratory subjects to varying doses and observe that higher doses produce stronger effects, while lower doses produce weaker effects. This pattern helps them understand the relationship between dosage and response. Which of Mill's methods does this research approach exemplify? A. Common factor method. B. Single difference method. C. Process of elimination method. D. Concomitant variation method. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D. Concomitant variation method. Explanation. Option D is correct because concomitant variation involves looking for a pattern of variation between a possible cause and effect, such as dose levels and response strength. Option A is incorrect because the common factor method looks for shared elements among cases rather than patterns of variation between different conditions. Option B is incorrect because the single difference method compares presence and absence of a factor, not graduated variations in cause and effect relationships. Option C is incorrect because process of elimination involves ruling out possibilities rather than examining how changes in one variable correlate with changes in another. Researchers test varying medication doses and observe that higher doses produce stronger effects, lower doses produce weaker effects. They're seeing a pattern where cause and effect change together. This is Mill's concomitant variation method, looking for how changes in one variable correlate with changes in another. The common factor method finds shared elements, not graduated variations. The single difference method compares presence versus absence, not different levels. Process of elimination rules out possibilities, not examining dose-response relationships. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When cause and effect vary together in a pattern, more of one means more of the other. That's concomitant variation. Quick recall hook, concomitant equal sign change together. 19. A mechanic troubleshooting a car problem runs diagnostic tests that rule out battery issues, then fuel system problems, then ignition system faults. Finally, only the transmission control module remains as the possible cause. Which of Mill's methods has the mechanic applied in this diagnostic process? A. Common factor method. B. Process of elimination. C. Concomitant variation method. D. Single difference method. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, B. Process of elimination. Explanation. Option B is correct because the process of elimination involves successively ruling out non-causal factors until one correct causal factor remains, matching the mechanic's approach. Option A is incorrect because the common factor method looks for shared elements among multiple cases rather than systematically eliminating possibilities from a single case. Option C is incorrect because concomitant variation involves examining patterns of change between variables rather than ruling out potential causes one by one. Option D is incorrect because the single difference method compares two situations to find what distinguishes them rather than eliminating possibilities sequentially. A mechanic runs diagnostics that rule out the battery, then the fuel system, then the ignition. Finally, only the transmission control module remains as the possible cause. This is Mill's process of elimination, successively ruling out non-causal factors until one correct factor remains. The common factor method looks for shared elements among multiple cases, not eliminating possibilities from one case. Concomitant variation examines patterns of change, not sequential ruling out. The single difference method compares two situations to find what distinguishes them, not eliminating options one by one. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone systematically rules out possibilities until one remains, that's process of elimination. Quick recall hook, elimination equal sign cross off until one left. 20. An economist wants to determine why certain neighbourhoods experienced increased home foreclosures. She identifies that widespread layoffs at a major employer occurred in those specific areas. According to Mill's framework, what type of causal claim is she developing through this analysis? A. A claim based on intuition. B. A claim based on preference. C. A claim based on common factor. D. A claim based on authority. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, C. A claim based on common factor. Explanation. Option C is correct because the economist identified a single shared factor among affected neighbourhoods, applying the common factor method to develop her causal claim. Option A is incorrect because intuition refers to hunches or gut feelings, while the economist systematically identified a shared characteristic among affected areas. Option B is incorrect because preference involves subjective choice without evidence, whereas the economist analysed observable conditions to establish a causal relationship. Option D is incorrect because appeal to authority involves citing experts to support claims rather than analysing shared factors among cases to determine causation. An economist investigates why certain neighbourhoods had more home foreclosures. She identifies that widespread layoffs at a major employer occurred in those specific areas. She found a shared factor among all affected neighbourhoods, the common factor method at work. She's developing a causal claim based on common factor. A claim based on intuition would be a hunch without systematic analysis. A claim based on preference involves subjective choice, not observable conditions. Appeal to authority means citing experts rather than analysing the shared characteristics yourself. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone identifies a shared element among affected cases to explain causation, they're making a claim based on common factor. Quick recall hook, common factor claim, equal sign, same cause across cases. 21. A student memorises the Pledge of Allegiance for a recital, but cannot explain what the words actually mean or apply the concepts to discussions about citizenship. According to Paul and Elder's framework for categorising information in the mind, what type of information has this student acquired? A. Activated knowledge. B. Activated ignorance. C. Reliable evidence. D. Inert information. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Inert information. Explanation. Option D is correct because inert information is memorized without understanding, where we think we comprehend it but cannot actually use or apply the knowledge. Option A is incorrect because activated knowledge involves understanding information insightfully and being able to apply it systematically to new situations encountered. Option B is incorrect because activated ignorance involves actively using false information we mistakenly believe to be true, not merely memorizing without understanding. Option C is incorrect because reliable evidence refers to the quality of supporting information rather than a category describing how information exists in the mind. Let's talk about how information sits in your mind. A student memorizes the Pledge of Allegiance perfectly for a recital, but can't explain what the words mean or apply those concepts to discussions about citizenship. Paul and Elder call this inert information, memorized without understanding. You think you know it, but you can't actually use it. Activated knowledge is the opposite. You understand it deeply and can apply it to new situations. Activated ignorance is different too. That's when you actively use false information thinking it's true. Reliable evidence describes the quality of supporting information, not how information exists in your mind. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone can recite something but can't explain or apply it, that's inert information. Quick recall hook. Inert equals sign in memory, not in use. 22. A manager accepts stereotypes about a particular demographic group and makes hiring decisions based on these false beliefs, genuinely thinking the stereotypes reflect reality. According to Paul and Elder, which category of information does this scenario demonstrate? A. Inert information. B. Activated knowledge. C. Activated ignorance. D. Questions of preference. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Activated ignorance. Explanation. Option C is correct, because activated ignorance involves taking false information into the mind and actively using it, while mistakenly believing it to be true. Option A is incorrect because the inert information is memorized but not understood or used, whereas the manager is actively applying the false beliefs in decision-making. Option B is incorrect because activated knowledge involves using true information insightfully, not acting on stereotypes that are demonstrably false beliefs. Option D is incorrect because questions of preference is a category of questions in Paul and Elder's framework, not a type of information existing in the mind. This scenario shows activated ignorance in action. A manager accepts stereotypes about a demographic group and makes hiring decisions based on these false beliefs, genuinely thinking the stereotypes are true. Paul and Elder define activated ignorance as taking false information into your mind and actively using it while believing it's accurate. The manager isn't just holding false beliefs passively, she's acting on them. Inert information is memorized but not understood or used, which doesn't fit here since she's actively applying the stereotypes. Activated knowledge involves using true information insightfully, not stereotypes. Questions of preference is a category of questions, not a type of information in the mind. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone actively uses false beliefs thinking they're true, That's activated ignorance. Quick recall hook. Activated ignorance equals sign acting on false as if true. 23. A researcher conducts controlled experiments using statistically valid samples and develops instruments for measuring outcomes to test her hypothesis about medication effectiveness according to the distinction between evidence types. What kind of evidence is she collecting through this systematic approach? A. Qualitative evidence. B. Quantitative evidence. C. Testimonial evidence. D. Intuitive evidence. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Quantitative evidence. Explanation option B is correct because quantitative evidence derives from scientific methods, including controlled experiments, statistically valid samples, and instruments for measuring outcomes. Option A is incorrect because qualitative evidence describes phenomena and communicates meaning through unstructured observation rather than controlled experimental methods. Option C is incorrect because testimonial evidence consists of accounts of others' personal experiences rather than systematic research using scientific methodology and measurement. Option D is incorrect because intuitive evidence refers to hunches or gut feelings, which lacks the rigorous methodology and measurement characterizing quantitative research. A researcher runs controlled experiments, uses statistically valid samples, and develops measurement instruments to test her hypothesis. What kind of evidence is this? Quantitative evidence. This type derives from scientific methods, controlled experiments, valid sampling, precise measurement. It's systematic and numerical. Qualitative evidence is different. It describes phenomena and communicates meaning through unstructured observation, not controlled experiments. Testimonial evidence consists of personal accounts from others' experiences, not scientific research. Intuitive evidence means hunches or gut feelings, which lack the rigorous methodology here. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Controlled experiments plus measurement instruments plus statistical samples equals quantitative evidence. Quick recall hook. Quantitative equals sign quantities measured scientifically. 24. Brown and Keeley argue that it is nearly impossible to establish the absolute truth of most claims. Instead, they suggest critical thinkers should ask a different question when evaluating claims. What should critical thinkers ask about claims according to their framework? A. Whether claims are dependable. B. Whether claims are popular. C. Whether claims are traditional. D. Whether claims are simple. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Whether claims are dependable. Explanation. Option A is correct because Brown and Keeley suggest asking whether claims are dependable rather than absolutely true, with dependability being a function of evidence quality. Option B is incorrect because popularity does not determine the validity or dependability of claims. Widely accepted claims may still lack quality supporting evidence. Option C is incorrect because tradition or historical acceptance does not establish claim dependability. Long-held beliefs may still be unsupported by quality evidence. Option D is incorrect because simplicity is not a criterion for evaluating claims. Complex claims may be well supported, while simple ones may lack evidence. Brown and Keeley make an important point. Establishing the absolute truth of most claims is nearly impossible. So what should critical thinkers ask instead? Whether claims are dependable. Dependability is a function of evidence quality. You're asking if the claim is supported well enough to rely on it. Popularity doesn't determine validity. Widely accepted claims may lack good evidence. Tradition doesn't establish dependability either. Long-held beliefs can still be unsupported. Simplicity isn't a criterion. Complex claims may be well supported, while simple ones may not be. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When evaluating claims, ask, is this dependable? Not, is this absolutely true? Quick recall hook. Dependable equals sign. Decent evidence backing it. 25. A journalist interviews witnesses about their personal experiences during a community event and uses their detailed accounts to support claims in her article. According to the framework for evidence sources, which type of evidence is the journalist primarily relying upon for her reporting? A. Research study evidence. B. Statistical evidence. C. Survey evidence. D. Testimonial evidence. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, D. Testimonial evidence. Explanation. Option D is correct because testimonial evidence consists of accounts of other people's personal experiences, which matches the journalist gathering witness stories about the event. Option A is incorrect because research study evidence involves systematic observations collected through scientific methods rather than personal accounts from event witnesses. Option B is incorrect because statistical evidence is expressed in numerical form, not through narrative accounts of personal experiences from individual witnesses. Option C is incorrect because survey evidence involves research instruments measuring attitudes or beliefs across populations rather than detailed individual witness accounts. A journalist interviews witnesses about their personal experiences during a community event and uses their detailed accounts in her article. What type of evidence is she relying on? Testimonial evidence, accounts of other people's personal experiences. She's gathering stories from people who were there. Research study evidence involves systematic observations through scientific methods, not personal witness accounts. Statistical evidence is expressed in numbers, not narrative stories. Survey evidence uses research instruments measuring attitudes across populations, not detailed individual accounts. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When evidence comes from people describing their personal experiences, that's testimonial evidence. Quick recall hook. Testimonial =, someone's personal testimony. 26. A debate team member deliberately uses emotionalism and intellectual trickery to make her weak arguments appear stronger, while distorting evidence that contradicts her position. According to Paul and Elder, which type of critical thinker does this behaviour most clearly characterise? A. Strong-sense critical thinker. B. Fair-minded critical thinker. C. Weak-sense critical thinker. D. Uncritical person. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Weak-sense critical thinker. Explanation. Option C is correct because weak-sense critical thinkers employ emotionalism, intellectual trickery, and hide or distort evidence to make unreasonable thinking appear reasonable. Option A is incorrect because strong-sense critical thinkers strive to be ethical and employ their thinking reasonably rather than manipulatively to win arguments. Option B is incorrect because fair-minded critical thinkers consider all viewpoints equally and hold themselves to the same standards they apply to others. Option D is incorrect because uncritical persons lack intellectual skills entirely, whereas the debater demonstrates skilled but unethical use of critical thinking. A debate team member deliberately uses emotionalism and intellectual trickery to make weak arguments look stronger while distorting contradictory evidence. Paul and Elder call this weak-sense critical thinking. The person has critical thinking skills but uses them unethically, to manipulate and win rather than to find truth. Strong-sense critical thinkers strive to be ethical and employ thinking reasonably, not manipulatively. Fair-minded critical thinkers consider all viewpoints equally and apply the same standards to themselves. An uncritical person lacks intellectual skills entirely, but this debater clearly has skills. She's just misusing them. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone uses critical thinking skills for manipulation rather than truth-seeking, that's weak-sense critical thinking. Quick recall hook. Weak-sense =, skills for selfish wins. 27. A policy analyst encounters research that contradicts her long-held position on healthcare reform. After careful consideration of the superior reasoning presented, She publicly changes her stance on the issue. Which characteristic of strong sense critical thinking does this scenario best demonstrate? A. Using intellectual trickery. B. Ignoring flaws in own thinking. C. Lacking fair-mindedness. D. Changing views when confronted with superior reasoning. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, D. Changing views when confronted with superior reasoning. Explanation. Option D is correct, because strong sense critical thinkers change their views when confronted with superior reasoning, demonstrating intellectual humility and commitment to truth. Option A is incorrect because using intellectual trickery characterizes weak sense critical thinkers who seek to win arguments through manipulation rather than reason. Option B is incorrect because ignoring flaws in one's own thinking is a characteristic of weak sense critical thinkers, not the thoughtful analyst. Option C is incorrect because lacking fair-mindedness describes weak sense critical thinking, whereas the analyst demonstrated openness to opposing viewpoints and evidence. A policy analyst encounters research contradicting her long-held position on healthcare reform. After careful consideration of the superior reasoning presented, she publicly changes her stance. This demonstrates strong sense critical thinking, specifically changing views when confronted with superior reasoning. It takes intellectual humility and commitment to truth. Using intellectual trickery characterizes weak sense thinking, where you manipulate to win. Ignoring flaws in your own thinking is also weak sense behavior. Lacking fair-mindedness describes weak sense critical thinkers. But this analyst showed openness to opposing evidence. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Willingness to change your position when you encounter better reasoning signals. Strong sense critical thinking. Quick recall hook. Strong sense equals sign strong enough to change. 28. Paul and Elder describe fair-mindedness as requiring the critical thinker to apply certain behaviours consistently. A manager evaluates her own team's proposals using the same rigorous criteria she applies when reviewing competitor proposals. Which fair-mindedness principle does she demonstrate? A. Expecting good reasoning from supporters only. B. Dismissing opposing viewpoints. C. Applying same standards to own and others' reasoning. D. Feeling no responsibility to represent opponents fairly. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, C. Applying same standards to own and others' reasoning. Explanation. Option C is correct because fair-mindedness yields the behaviour of applying the same critical criteria to one's own logic as to the reasoning of others. Option A is incorrect because fair-minded thinkers expect good reasoning from both supporters and opponents, not just from those who agree with them. Option B is incorrect because dismissing opposing viewpoints characterises intellectual unfairness, which is the opposite of what fair-minded thinkers practice consistently. Option D is incorrect because feeling no responsibility to represent opponents fairly describes the intellectually unfair person, not the fair-minded critical thinker. A manager evaluates her own team's proposals using the same rigorous criteria she applies when reviewing competitor proposals. This is fair-mindedness, applying the same standards to your own reasoning as to others. Paul and Elder describe this as a key behaviour of fair-minded thinkers. Expecting good reasoning only from supporters is unfair. Fair-minded thinkers expect it from everyone, including themselves. Dismissing opposing viewpoints is intellectual unfairness, the opposite of what we see here. Feeling no responsibility to represent opponents fairly describes the intellectually unfair person. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone applies identical critical standards to their own work and to others' work, that's fair-mindedness in action. Quick recall hook. Fair-minded equals sign same ruler for all. 29. Paul and Elder identify 3 types of thinkers in their framework. A corporate executive uses sophisticated persuasion techniques to advance personal interests while actively working to suppress viewpoints that threaten her agenda. According to their classification, which type of thinker is this executive? A. Uncritical person. B. Skilled manipulator. C. Fair-minded critical person. D. Advanced thinker. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, B. Skilled manipulator. Explanation: option B is correct because skilled manipulators are weak-sense critical thinkers who pursue self-interest through manipulation and try to keep opposing viewpoints from being heard. Option A is incorrect because uncritical persons are intellectually unskilled, whereas the executive demonstrates sophisticated thinking skills used for selfish purposes. Option C is incorrect because fair-minded critical persons reject manipulation and want all points of view expressed, contradicting the executive's suppressive behaviour. Option D is incorrect because advanced thinker is not one of the three thinker types Paul and Elder describe in their framework for categorising thinkers. Paul and Elder identify three types of thinkers. A corporate executive uses sophisticated persuasion techniques for personal interests while actively suppressing viewpoints that threaten her agenda. This is a skilled manipulator, a weak-sense critical thinker who pursues self-interest through manipulation and keeps opposing viewpoints from being heard. Uncritical persons lack intellectual skills entirely, but this executive clearly has sophisticated skills. She just misuses them. Fair-minded critical persons reject manipulation and want all viewpoints expressed. Advanced thinker isn't even one of Paul and Elder's three categories. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Sophisticated thinker using skills selfishly while suppressing opposition equals skilled manipulator. Quick recall hook: skilled manipulator =, smart but selfish. 30. Paul and Elder distinguish between weak sense and strong sense critical thinking based on the presence or absence of a key intellectual virtue. A researcher consistently strives to empathise with viewpoints that conflict with her own findings. Which virtue is she demonstrating that characterises strong sense thinking? A. Intellectual manipulation. B. Intellectual domination. C. Intellectual fair-mindedness. D. Intellectual trickery. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Intellectual fair-mindedness. Explanation: option C is correct, because strong sense critical thinking requires fair-mindedness, combined with basic critical thinking skills, including empathizing with others' viewpoints consistently. Option A is incorrect because intellectual manipulation characterizes weak sense critical thinkers who use their skills to advance selfish interests rather than seek truth. Option B is incorrect because intellectual domination is a tactic of egocentric thinkers who use power to get what they want rather than engage fairly. Option D is incorrect because intellectual trickery is a tool of weak sense critical thinkers who seek to win arguments through deception rather than reasoning. What distinguishes weak sense from strong sense critical thinking? A key intellectual virtue, fair-mindedness. A researcher who consistently strives to empathize with viewpoints that conflict with her own findings demonstrates this virtue. Strong sense critical thinking requires fair-mindedness, combined with basic critical thinking skills, including genuine empathy for opposing perspectives. Intellectual manipulation characterizes weak sense thinkers who advance selfish interests. Intellectual domination is an egocentric tactic, using power rather than fair engagement. Intellectual trickery is a weak sense tool for winning through deception. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Empathizing with opposing viewpoints signals intellectual fair-mindedness, the hallmark of strong sense thinking. Quick recall hook: fair-mindedness =, feel their side fairly. 31. According to Paul and Elder, the mind performs three basic functions that continuously interact with each other. when a professional interprets events in her life by sorting them into categories and finding patterns to understand what is happening. Which function of the mind is she primarily using? A. Feeling. B. Wanting. C. Thinking. D. Desiring. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Thinking. Explanation. Option C is correct because thinking creates meaning by sorting events into categories and finding patterns, informing us about what is going on in our lives. Option A is incorrect because feeling monitors the meanings created by thinking and evaluates whether events are positive or negative based on assigned meaning. Option B is incorrect because wanting allocates energy into action based on what we define as desirable and possible, not interpreting or categorizing events. Option D is incorrect because desiring is encompassed within the wanting function, rather than being a separate function of the mind in Paul and Elder's framework. Paul and Elder describe three basic functions of the mind that continuously interact. When a professional interprets events by sorting them into categories and finding patterns to understand what's happening. Which function is she using? Thinking. The thinking function creates meaning by categorizing and finding patterns. It tells us what's going on. Feeling monitors the meanings thinking creates and evaluates whether events are positive or negative. Wanting allocates energy into action based on what we see as desirable and possible. Desiring is part of the wanting function, not a separate function. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Categorizing, pattern finding, and meaning making equals the thinking function. Quick recall hook. Thinking equals making sense of things. 32. An employee receives critical feedback from her supervisor and immediately feels defensive and anxious. According to Paul and Elder's framework of mind functions, which function is monitoring her interpretation of the feedback and generating her emotional response? A. Thinking. B. Analyzing. C. Wanting. D. Feeling. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Feeling. Explanation. Option D is correct because feeling monitors the meanings created by thinking and evaluates whether events are positive or negative, generating emotional responses accordingly. Option A is incorrect because thinking creates meaning and interprets events, but the emotional response of defensiveness comes from the feeling function's evaluation. Option B is incorrect because analyzing is part of the thinking function rather than a separate function that Paul and Elder identify in their framework. Option C is incorrect because wanting allocates energy toward action, rather than monitoring interpretations and generating the emotional responses to events. An employee receives critical feedback and immediately feels defensive and anxious. According to Paul and Elder's framework, which function is generating that emotional response? Feeling. The feeling function monitors the meanings created by thinking and evaluates whether events are positive or negative, then generates emotions accordingly. Thinking creates the interpretation, but the defensive emotional response comes from feeling. Analyzing is part of thinking, not a separate function. Wanting allocates energy toward action, not the monitoring and emotional responses. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Emotional responses like defensiveness, anxiety, or joy come from the feeling function monitoring our interpretations. Quick recall hook. Feeling equals emotions from evaluation. 33. A graduate student believes she's being unfairly criticized by her advisor, feels resentful about the situation, and wants to defend her work vigorously. According to Paul and Elder, how do these three mental activities relate to one another in her experience? A. They operate completely independently. B. They function in strict sequence only. C. They interrelate closely and dynamically. D. Only thinking influences the others. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. They interrelate closely and dynamically. Explanation. Option C is correct because thinking, feeling, and wanting interrelate closely and dynamically, with each continually influencing the other two whenever one is operative. Option A is incorrect because Paul and Elder explicitly state that the three functions do not operate independently, but rather interact continuously with one another. Option B is incorrect because the three functions influence each other dynamically, rather than only operating in a fixed sequential order during mental processing. Option D is incorrect because all three functions influence each other mutually, not just thinking. Feelings and wants also shape our interpretations and categorizations. A graduate student believes she's being unfairly criticized, feels resentful, and wants to defend her work vigorously. How do these three mental activities relate? According to Paul and Elder, thinking, feeling, and wanting interrelate closely and dynamically. Each continually influences the other two whenever one is operative. They don't operate independently. Paul and Elder explicitly say they interact continuously. They don't function in strict sequence only. The influence is dynamic and multi-directional. And it's not that only thinking influences the others. Feelings and wants also shape interpretations. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Thinking, feeling, and wanting are always interacting dynamically, not independently or sequentially. Quick recall hook, three functions equal sign three-way dance. 34. Paul and Elder emphasize understanding the interrelationship among thoughts, feelings, and motivation for critical thinking development. A manager wants to pursue a promotion and directs her energy toward actions that will help achieve this career goal. Which mind function is primarily driving her behavior? A. Feeling. B. Thinking. C. Analyzing. D. Wanting. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Wanting. Explanation. Option D is correct, because wanting allocates energy into action consistently with how we define what is desirable and possible, driving us to pursue goals. Option A is incorrect because feeling monitors and evaluates whether events are positive or negative, rather than directing energy toward achieving specific goals. Option B is incorrect because thinking creates meaning and interprets situations rather than allocating the energy that drives us to pursue desired outcomes. Option C is incorrect because analyzing is a component of the thinking function rather than a separate function responsible for directing energy toward action. A manager wants to pursue a promotion and directs her energy toward actions that will help achieve this career goal. Which mind function is driving her behavior? Wanting. The wanting function allocates energy into action based on what we define as desirable and possible. It drives us towards goals. Feeling monitors and evaluates whether events are positive or negative. It doesn't direct energy towards specific goals. Thinking creates meaning and interprets situations. It doesn't allocate the energy that drives pursuit. Analyzing is a component of thinking, not a separate function. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Directing energy toward goals and desired outcomes is the wanting function at work. Quick recall hook. Wanting equal sign will towards goals. 35. Paul and Elder state that when critical thinkers recognize that every feeling motivates them towards some action, they gain a specific analytical capability. What does this recognition enable the critical thinker to begin doing according to their framework? A. Analyzing the thinking underlying emotions and desires. B. Ignoring emotional responses entirely. C. Eliminating the wanting function. D. Separating feelings from all thoughts. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer. A. Analyzing the thinking underlying emotions and desires. Explanation. Option A is correct because recognizing the connection between feelings and motivation enables critical thinkers to begin analysing the thinking that underlies their emotions and desires. Option B is incorrect because critical thinking involves understanding emotions rather than ignoring them. Emotions provide important information about our interpretations. Option C is incorrect because eliminating the wanting function is neither possible nor desirable. All three functions are inherent aspects of mental life. Option D is incorrect because the three functions are inherently interconnected and cannot be completely separated. The goal is understanding their interrelationship. Paul and Elder say, when critical thinkers recognize that every feeling motivates them towards some action, they gain a specific capability. What does this recognition enable? Analyzing the thinking underlying emotions and desires. Understanding the connection between feelings and motivation lets you dig into the thinking behind those emotions. You don't ignore emotions. They provide important information about your interpretations. You can't eliminate the wanting function. All three functions are inherent to mental life. You can't completely separate feelings from thoughts. They're interconnected. The goal is understanding the interrelationship. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Recognizing the feeling-motivation connection enables analyzing the thinking underneath your emotions. Quick recall hook. Feel it, then find the thought behind it. 36. During a city council debate, a council member attacks her opponent's character and personal history rather than addressing the substance of his budget proposal. According to the common fallacies identified in critical thinking, which fallacy is the council member committing? A. Red herring. B. Begging the question. C. Ad hominem. D. Appeal to popularity. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Ad hominem. Explanation: option C is correct because ad hominem involves dismissing an argument by attacking the person who offers it rather than by refuting the reasoning itself. Option A is incorrect because red herring involves introducing an irrelevant topic to divert attention from the issue rather than attacking the opponent personally. Option B is incorrect because begging the question involves asserting a conclusion that is assumed in the reasoning rather than attacking the person making an argument. Option D is incorrect because appeal to popularity involves citing majority sentiment as justification rather than attacking someone's character to dismiss their argument. During a city council debate, a member attacks her opponent's character and personal history rather than addressing his budget proposal. This is ad hominem, dismissing an argument by attacking the person who makes it rather than refuting the reasoning. Red herring introduces an irrelevant topic to divert attention. It doesn't attack the person. Begging the question assumes the conclusion in the reasoning. It's not a personal attack. Appeal to popularity cites majority sentiment as justification. Again, not about attacking character. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone attacks the person instead of the argument, that's ad hominem. Quick recall hook, ad hominem equals sign. Attack the human, not the argument. 37. A pharmaceutical advertisement claims their medication is effective because a famous celebrity endorses it without presenting any clinical evidence supporting the drug's benefits. According to critical thinking principles, which fallacy does this advertising approach represent? A. Appeal to authority. B. Hasty generalization. C. Straw man. D. Either or fallacy. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, A. Appeal to authority. Explanation. Option A is correct because appeal to authority involves justifying support for a position by citing a well-known figure who supports it without addressing the merits. Option B is incorrect because hasty generalization involves inferring a general proposition from too small or unrepresentative a sample rather than citing famous endorsers. Option C is incorrect because straw man involves distorting an opponent's argument to attack it more easily, rather than using celebrity endorsements for credibility. Option D is incorrect because either-or fallacy assumes only two alternatives exist when more options are available, rather than relying on authority figures. A pharmaceutical ad claims a medication is effective because a famous celebrity endorses it. No clinical evidence presented. This is appeal to authority, justifying a position by citing a well-known figure who supports it without addressing the actual merit. Hasty generalization infers a general proposition from too small or unrepresentative a sample. That's not the issue here. Straw man distorts an opponent's argument to attack it more easily. There's no distortion happening. Either-or fallacy assumes only two alternatives exist when more are available. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Using a famous person's endorsement instead of actual evidence is appeal to authority. Quick recall hook. Appeal to authority =, famous face, no facts. 38. A politician argues that if the city allows one small business to operate past midnight, soon all businesses will demand extended hours, leading to a lawless environment with no regulations whatsoever. Which fallacy is the politician employing in this argument? A. Ad hominem. B. Two wrongs make a right. C. Begging the question. D. Slippery slope. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Slippery slope. Explanation. Option D is correct because slippery slope suggests that one step will inevitably lead to similar steps with undesirable consequences, used to justify not taking an initial action. Option A is incorrect because ad hominem attacks the person making an argument, rather than suggesting a chain of inevitable negative consequences from an action. Option B is incorrect because two wrongs make a right involves defending wrong conduct by pointing to similar wrongs done by others, rather than predicting escalation. Option C is incorrect because begging the question involves assuming the conclusion in the reasoning rather than predicting a chain of increasingly negative outcomes. A politician argues that allowing one small business to operate past midnight will inevitably lead to all businesses demanding extended hours, resulting in a lawless environment with no regulations. This is slippery slope, suggesting one step will inevitably lead to similar steps with undesirable consequences, used to justify not taking the initial action. Ad hominem attacks the person, not the argument. Two wrongs make a right defends wrong conduct by pointing to similar wrongs done by others. Begging the question assumes the conclusion in the reasoning. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone claims one small step will inevitably cascade into disaster, that's slippery slope. Quick recall hook. Slippery slope =, one step to doom. 39. A manager proposes a new scheduling system to improve efficiency. Her colleague dismisses the proposal by exaggerating its requirements, claiming it would force employees to work around the clock with no flexibility whatsoever, which was never part of the original proposal. Which fallacy has the colleague committed? A. Slippery slope. B. Red herring. C. Straw man. D. Appeal to fear. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Straw man. Explanation. Option C is correct because straw man involves distorting or exaggerating an opponent's argument so that it might be more easily attacked and dismissed. Option A is incorrect because slippery slope predicts a chain of increasingly negative consequences rather than distorting the content of the original argument itself. Option B is incorrect because red herring introduces an irrelevant topic to divert attention rather than misrepresenting the substance of the proposal being discussed. Option D is incorrect because appeal to fear cites frightening outcomes as reasons to support an argument rather than distorting an opponent's actual position. A manager proposes a new scheduling system. Her colleague dismisses it by exaggerating the requirements, claiming it would force employees to work around the clock with no flexibility, which was never part of the original proposal. This is strawman, distorting or exaggerating an opponent's argument so it's easier to attack. Slippery slope predicts a chain of negative consequences. It doesn't distort the original argument. Red herring introduces an irrelevant topic to divert attention. It doesn't misrepresent the proposal. Appeal to fear cites frightening outcomes as reasons to support an argument. The issue here is distortion, not fear-mongering. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone misrepresents or exaggerates your argument to attack it, that's strawman. Quick recall hook, strawman =, set up fake version, knock it down. 40. During a board meeting discussion about expanding into new markets, a director suddenly brings up unrelated complaints about the company cafeteria menu to divert attention from the controversial expansion proposal. Which fallacy best describes this diversionary tactic? A. Strawman. B. Ad hominem. C. Red herring. D. Begging the question. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Red herring. Explanation, option C is correct because red herring involves introducing an irrelevant point or topic to divert attention from the issue at hand during a discussion. Option A is incorrect because strawman involves distorting an opponent's argument rather than introducing completely unrelated topics to change the subject. Option B is incorrect because ad hominem attacks the person making an argument rather than introducing irrelevant topics to divert attention from issues. Option D is incorrect because begging the question assumes the conclusion in the reasoning rather than introducing unrelated topics to redirect discussion away from issues. During a board meeting about expanding into new markets, a director suddenly brings up unrelated complaints about the company cafeteria menu to divert attention from the controversial proposal. This is red herring, introducing an irrelevant point or topic to divert attention from the issue at hand. Strawman distorts an opponent's argument. This doesn't involve distortion, just topic changing. Ad hominem attacks the person making an argument. No personal attacks here. Begging the question assumes the conclusion in the reasoning. This is about diversion, not circular reasoning. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone introduces a completely unrelated topic to change the subject, that's red herring. Quick recall hook, red herring =, wrong scent, wrong trail. 41. A researcher consistently remembers only the data and studies that support her hypothesis, while forgetting or dismissing evidence that contradicts her conclusions. According to Paul and Elder's framework of egocentric tendencies, which pathological pattern does this researcher exhibit? A. Egocentric myopia. B. Egocentric righteousness. C. Egocentric blindness. D. Egocentric memory. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, D. Egocentric memory. Explanation, option D is correct because egocentric memory involves remembering only that evidence and information that supports our thinking while forgetting contradictory evidence. Option A is incorrect because egocentric myopia involves adopting an overly narrow point of view and thinking in absolutes rather than selectively remembering information. Option B is incorrect because egocentric righteousness involves feeling superior because of possessing the truth rather than selectively remembering supporting evidence only. Option C is incorrect because egocentric blindness involves not seeing contradictory facts rather than selectively remembering only evidence that supports existing beliefs. Let's look at a specific egocentric tendency Paul and Elder identify. A researcher consistently remembers only data and studies supporting her hypothesis while forgetting or dismissing contradictory evidence. This is egocentric memory, selectively remembering what supports your thinking while conveniently forgetting what doesn't. It's not a conscious choice. The mind just filters information to protect existing beliefs. Egocentric myopia is different. That's adopting an overly narrow viewpoint and thinking in absolutes. Egocentric righteousness involves feeling superior because you possess the truth. Egocentric blindness means not seeing contradictory facts at all, whereas egocentric memory is about selectively remembering. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone remembers supporting evidence but forgets contradictory evidence, that's egocentric memory. Quick recall hook, egocentric memory =. Mine remembers only what it likes. 42. A manager publicly advocates for work-life balance and flexible scheduling policies, but privately demands her own teamwork overtime and weekends without complaint. According to Paul and Elder, which egocentric tendency does this inconsistency between her public standards and private actions exemplify? A. Egocentric oversimplification. B. Egocentric hypocrisy. C. Egocentric immediacy. D. Egocentric absurdity. Do you know the answer? D. Correct answer, B. Egocentric hypocrisy. Explanation. Option B is correct because egocentric hypocrisy involves ignoring inconsistencies between belief and behaviour and between public standards and private actions demonstrated here. Option A is incorrect because egocentric oversimplification involves ignoring complexity and embracing simplicity rather than demonstrating inconsistency between standards and actions. Option C is incorrect because egocentric immediacy involves overgeneralizing based on immediate events rather than maintaining contradictory public and private positions. Option D is incorrect because egocentric absurdity involves failing to recognize thinking with absurd consequences rather than living inconsistently with stated beliefs. Here's another egocentric tendency worth knowing. A manager publicly advocates for work-life balance and flexible scheduling, but privately demands her own teamwork overtime and weekends without complaint. That gap between public standards and private actions is egocentric hypocrisy. Paul and Elder describe this as ignoring inconsistencies between what you say you believe and how you actually behave. Egocentric oversimplification means ignoring complexity and embracing simplicity. Not this scenario. Egocentric immediacy involves overgeneralizing based on immediate events. Egocentric absurdity means failing to recognize when your thinking leads to absurd consequences. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When someone's public statements contradict their private actions, that's egocentric hypocrisy. Quick recall hook. Hypocrisy =, say one thing, do another. 43. Paul and Elder identify specific corrective behaviours for egocentric tendencies. A professional who typically adopts narrow viewpoints decides to actively consider perspectives that conflict with her own established positions. Which egocentric tendency is she working to correct through this practice? A. Egocentric myopia. B. Egocentric memory. C. Egocentric righteousness. D. Egocentric hypocrisy. What do you think is the answer? D. Correct answer, A. Egocentric myopia. Explanation. Option A is correct because egocentric myopia involves adopting an overly narrow point of view, and the corrective behaviour is considering conflicting viewpoints as described. Option B is incorrect because egocentric memory involves selectively remembering supporting evidence, corrected by seeking evidence that contradicts rather than viewpoints that conflict. Option C is incorrect because egocentric righteousness involves feeling superior for possessing truth, corrected by reminding oneself how little one actually knows. Option D is incorrect because egocentric hypocrisy involves inconsistency between beliefs and behaviours, corrected by comparing standards and actions to expose contradictions. Paul and Elder identify corrective behaviours for each egocentric tendency. A professional who typically adopts narrow viewpoints decides to actively consider perspectives that conflict with her established positions. She's correcting egocentric myopia. Myopia means adopting an overly narrow point of view, and the fix is deliberately seeking conflicting viewpoints. Egocentric memory is corrected by seeking contradictory evidence, not just conflicting viewpoints. Egocentric righteousness is corrected by reminding yourself how little you actually know. Egocentric hypocrisy is corrected by comparing your standards and actions to expose contradictions. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Actively considering conflicting viewpoints corrects egocentric myopia, the narrow view problem. Quick recall hook. Myopia = narrow view. Fix with wider perspectives. 44. According to Paul and Elder, egocentric thinkers often employ specific tactics to get what they selfishly want. An ambitious employee consistently flatters executives and caters to powerful colleagues who can advance his career goals. Which egocentric tactic does this behavior represent? A. Domination. B. Rationalization. C. Submission. D. Manipulation. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, C. Submission. Explanation. Option C is correct because submission or strategic subservience involves catering to those with power or prestige who can advance the egocentric thinker's selfish goals. Option A is incorrect because domination involves using direct power over others to get what one wants rather than catering to those who hold power. Option B is incorrect because rationalization is a general defense mechanism rather than a specific tactic. Paul and Elder identify for egocentric goal achievement. Option D is incorrect because while manipulation is related, submission specifically describes the strategic subservience to powerful people for personal advancement. Paul and Elder describe specific tactics egocentric thinkers use to get what they want. An ambitious employee consistently flatters executives and caters to powerful colleagues who can advance his career. This is submission, or strategic subservience. You're catering to people with power who can help you achieve your selfish goals. Domination is different. That's using direct power over others to get what you want. Rationalization is a general defense mechanism, not one of the specific egocentric tactics Paul and Elder identify. Manipulation is related but broader. Submission specifically means strategic subservience to the powerful. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Flattering and catering to powerful people for personal gain is submission. Quick recall hook. Submission = suck up to move up. 45. Paul and Elder describe egocentrism as one of the main barriers to effective critical thinking. They characterize egocentric thinking using a specific term that captures the inflexibility of this thinking pattern. What term do they use to describe this characteristic? A. Emotional reasoning. B. Rigidity of thought. C. Logical progression. D. Systematic analysis. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, B. Rigidity of thought. Explanation. Option B is correct because Paul and Elder describe egocentricity as rigidity of thought, representing one of the main barriers to effective critical thinking development. Option A is incorrect because emotional reasoning describes thinking driven by feelings rather than the specific inflexibility Paul and Elder attribute to egocentric patterns. Option C is incorrect because logical progression describes sound reasoning processes rather than the barrier to critical thinking that egocentrism represents. Option D is incorrect because systematic analysis describes a disciplined thinking approach rather than the problematic inflexibility characterizing egocentric thinking patterns. Paul and Elder describe egocentrism as a main barrier to critical thinking and characterize it with a specific term. What term captures the inflexibility of egocentric thinking? Rigidity of thought. Egocentric thinkers are inflexible. They can't or won't adapt their thinking when presented with new information or perspectives. Emotional reasoning describes thinking driven by feelings. That's not the term Paul and Elder use for egocentrism's defining characteristic. Logical progression describes sound reasoning, the opposite of a barrier. Systematic analysis is a disciplined thinking approach, again the opposite of what egocentrism represents. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Paul and Elder characterize egocentrism as rigidity of thought, inflexible thinking that won't budge. Quick recall hook: egocentrism = rigid, won't bend. 46. A company reports that the average employee salary is over $90,000 annually. However, this figure is calculated by adding all salaries and dividing by the number of employees, which is heavily skewed by executive compensation. Which type of average does this calculation represent? A. Median. B. Mode. C. Mean. D. Range. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, C. Mean. Explanation. Option C is correct because the mean is derived by adding up all values and dividing the sum by the total number of values, which can be skewed by outliers. Option A is incorrect because the median represents the middle value in a series where half are above and half below, which would not be skewed by extremes. Option B is incorrect because the mode is the value that appears most frequently in a series rather than an average calculated through addition and division. Option D is incorrect because range measures the spread between highest and lowest values rather than calculating any type of average for the data. Statistics questions are fair game on this exam. A company reports that the average employee salary is over $90,000 annually. They calculated this by adding all salaries and dividing by the number of employees, but it's heavily skewed by executive compensation. Which type of average is this? The mean. The mean is calculated by adding all values and dividing by the total count. Problem is, outliers like executive salaries can skew it dramatically. The median is the middle value where half are above and half below. It wouldn't be skewed this way. The mode is the most frequently appearing value, not an addition and division calculation. Range measures the spread between highest and lowest, not an average at all. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Add everything up, divide by count, get skewed by outliers, that's the mean. Quick recall hook: mean = math average, messed up by extremes. 47. A news report claims that violent crime increased by 300% in a small town last year. A critical thinker recognises this statistic may be misleading without additional context. According to statistical evaluation principles, what information is needed to properly assess this percentage? A. The median crime rate. B. The mode of crime types. C. The absolute numbers involved. D. The national crime average. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer, C. The absolute numbers involved. Explanation. Option C is correct because percentages are impossible to interpret without knowing the absolute numbers from which they are derived to gauge actual significance. Option A is incorrect because median crime rate would not clarify whether the 300% increase represents significant or trivial changes in actual incidents. Option B is incorrect because the mode of crime types indicates frequency of categories rather than clarifying the meaning of the percentage increase. Option D is incorrect because national averages provide comparison context but do not address the fundamental issue of interpreting the percentage's actual magnitude. A news report claims violent crime increased by 300% in a small town last year. Sounds alarming, right? But a critical thinker knows this statistic may be misleading without additional context. What do you need to properly assess this percentage? The absolute numbers involved. Percentages are impossible to interpret without knowing the actual numbers behind them. A 300% increase from 1 crime to 4 crimes is very different from a 300% increase from 1,000 to 4,000. The median crime rate wouldn't clarify the actual magnitude. The mode of crime types tells you frequency of categories, not what the percentage means. National averages provide comparison but don't address interpreting the percentage itself. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Always ask for absolute numbers when percentages are presented. Percentages without base numbers can mislead. Quick recall hook. Percentage without numbers, equal sign, possibly meaningless. 48. A drug company reports that their new medication reduces the risk of a condition from 6% to 2%. They advertise this as a 66% risk reduction in their marketing materials. According to statistical principles about risk reporting, which type of risk reduction are they emphasizing? A. Relative risk reduction. B. Absolute risk reduction. C. Statistical risk reduction. D. Baseline risk reduction. Do you know the answer? Correct answer, A. Relative risk reduction. Explanation. Option A is correct because relative risk reduction expresses the proportional change between two rates, making treatment effects appear more significant than absolute differences. Option B is incorrect because absolute risk reduction would express the actual difference between rates, which is 4% rather than the 66% figure. Option C is incorrect because statistical risk reduction is not a specific term used to distinguish between the different ways of expressing treatment effects. Option D is incorrect because baseline risk reduction is not a recognized category for distinguishing how risk changes are communicated in statistical reporting. A drug company reports their medication reduces risk of a condition from 6% to 2%. In their marketing, they advertise this as a 66% risk reduction. Which type of risk reduction are they emphasizing? Relative risk reduction. It expresses the proportional change between two rates, and it makes treatment effects look more impressive than they might actually be. The absolute risk reduction would express the actual difference between rates. 6% minus 2% equals 4%. That sounds less dramatic than 66%, doesn't it? Statistical risk reduction isn't a recognized term, neither is baseline risk reduction. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When a percentage reduction is calculated as a proportion of the original rate, that's relative risk reduction, and it can make small differences look huge. Quick recall hook. Relative equal sign ratio makes it look big. 49. A research study concludes that employees who drink coffee are more productive than those who do not. A critical thinker notes that other factors like sleep quality, job satisfaction, or work environment could also explain productivity differences. According to critical thinking principles about causation, what concept describes these alternative explanations? A. Statistical outliers. B. Rival causes. C. Sampling errors. D. Measurement bias. Can you guess the answer? Correct answer, B. Rival causes. Explanation. Option B is correct because rival causes are plausible, alternative explanations for why an outcome happened, and their existence should give pause before accepting explanations. Option A is incorrect because statistical outliers are extreme data points that differ significantly from other observations rather than alternative explanations for outcomes. Option C is incorrect because sampling errors involve problems with how study participants were selected rather than alternative explanations for observed relationships. Option D is incorrect because measurement bias involves systematic errors in how data is collected rather than competing explanations for why outcomes occurred. A research study concludes that coffee drinking employees are more productive than non-coffee drinkers. But wait, a critical thinker notes that other factors like sleep quality, job satisfaction, or work environment could also explain the productivity differences. What concept describes these alternative explanations? rival causes. These are plausible alternative explanations for why an outcome happened. Their existence should make you pause before accepting the stated cause. Statistical outliers are extreme data points, not alternative explanations. Sampling errors involve problems with how participants were selected. Measurement bias involves systematic errors in data collection. None of those describe competing causal explanations. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. When other factors could explain the same outcome, those are rival causes, and they weaken causal claims. Quick recall hook. Rival causes =, other reasons it could have happened. 50. For statistical research findings to be valid and generalizable to a larger population, the study sample must meet certain criteria. According to critical thinking principles about statistical validity, which characteristic must a sample possess to accurately represent the whole population being studied? A. Convenience. B. Familiarity. C. Affordability. D. Randomness. What do you think is the answer? Correct answer: D. Randomness. Explanation: option D is correct because random sampling ensures every member of the population has an equal chance of being included, thus minimizing bias and maximizing representativeness. Option A is incorrect because convenience sampling selects participants based on ease of access, which does not guarantee representation of the entire population. Option B is incorrect because familiarity with participants introduces bias, as the sample would not reflect the diversity of the overall population. Option C is incorrect because affordability is a logistical consideration that does not ensure the sample accurately represents the population's characteristics. Last question, and it's about sampling. For statistical research findings to be valid and generalizable to a larger population, the sample must meet a key criterion. What characteristic must a sample possess? Randomness. A random sample is representative of the whole population, with no selection bias. It's more likely to yield results that accurately reflect everyone. Convenience sampling selects participants based on accessibility, not representativeness. That introduces bias. Familiarity with participants can actually introduce bias through personal connections. Affordability addresses practical constraints, not methodological requirements for accurate representation. Here's a WGU D265 OA exam tip for you. Valid generalizable research requires random sampling, representative of the whole population with no selection bias. Quick recall hook. Random =, representative, no cherry picking. You have reached the end of our first question set. For the free complete exam preparation, visit our website, link in the description, where you find thousands more practice questions and comprehensive study guides. Thanks for studying with us today. See you in the next video.